The Charmides begins with Socrates arriving back in Athens after years of service in the army and a recent escape from a brutal battle. He heads for a palestra to find his old friends, who ask him about the battle. He asks them, in turn, about the state of philosophy in Athens and whether there are any particularly wise or beautiful youths there at the moment. One such youth, of unsurpassed beauty and solid temperance, is said to be Charmides, who enters the temple almost immediately. Socrates is awestruck by Charmides' beauty and manages to persuade Critias, Socrates' friend and Charmides' older cousin, to convince Charmides to come over by telling him that Socrates has a cure for Charmides' headaches. Socrates persuades Charmides that the mystical cure treats not just the body but the soul as well, making the soul temperate. Charmides agrees to receive the charm, but Socrates first must make an inquiry to find out if Charmides is actually already temperate of soul, as everyone says that he is. The inquiry proceeds with Charmides attempting to define temperance. He first tries to define it as quietness and modesty, but both are shown by Socrates not to match the definition of temperance, which Charmides concedes is always good. Socrates refutes this by saying that quietness is not good in some pursuits and modesty is also sometimes bad when one is needy, for example. Charmides then uses a borrowed definition he heard from Critias that temperance is doing our own business. Socrates refutes this as well on the grounds that craftsmen, for example, can be temperate even though they do or make things for other people. Therefore, they are not only doing their own business but that of others as well, which does not fall into the definition of temperance given by Charmides. Critias now jumps in and says that temperance lies in doing good. Socrates expands this proposition to involve doing good both for other people and for oneself, but quickly shows that people often do not know which of their actions will be beneficial in these ways. Thus, it seems possible to be temperate without self-knowledge. Critias objects strongly to the suggestion that one might be temperate without knowing that temperance, and revises the whole argument, making self-knowledge the new definition of temperance. The two debaters decide that if temperance is a kind of knowledge, then it must be a kind of science. Critias's initial suggestion is that temperance is the science of a man's self, though it remains unclear, as Socrates points out, what product or effect such a science is supposed to have. At this point, there is a brief but significant interruption in the argument, as Critias accuses Socrates of trying only to refute whatever he says rather than developing the argument. A similar thing was said by Cleitophon in another dialogue of Plato called the Cleitophon, in which Cleitophon says to Socrates that he only seems to refute other people's arguments rather than developing the argument based on his own knowledge. We talked about the Cleitophon in one of our earlier videos. Anyway, Socrates replies to this accusation by noting that refutation has nothing to do with positive arguments attached to individuals. It is rather precisely the way the argument proceeds. The assertion now that temperance is a kind of self-knowing science is developed into the hypothesis that temperance must be a science of itself and of all the other sciences. A science of science, perhaps. Further, Socrates adds, in order to be truly self-knowing, such knowledge must also know what it does not know. The science of temperance seems to be a very difficult notion to conceive of. Socrates is unsure if such a knowledge can exist at all, and he is further unsure if it would do any good at all. The two decide to drop the question of whether such a knowledge of knowledge can exist at all and focus on whether, if it did exist, it would be of any use. In seeking a use value for this kind of reflexive knowledge, it rapidly becomes clear how difficult it is to conceive of any possible links between knowledge whose subject matter is purely knowledge and knowledge that has concrete subject matter, like medicine or architecture, for example. Socrates suggests that perhaps he and Critias were aiming too high in defining temperance strictly in terms of pure idealized self-knowledge. How, after all, can pure self-knowledge rule over all knowledge of concrete people and things? Socrates proposes a different less ambitious version of the same idea, that knowledge of knowledge helps frame or guide more concrete learning. This revised hypothesis is promptly dropped as Socrates recounts a dream of the perfect state ruled by wisdom, which he defines as knowledge of knowledge. The problem is that he cannot convince himself that, even in such a perfect state, everyone would really be happy. Again, the problem is the link between ideal temperance or wisdom and specific happiness. What is it in knowledge of knowledge that actually makes people happy? Critias briefly suggests a compromise solution in a kind of science of the good or science of advantage, which would apply to all other sciences but which would itself be a specific, concrete science. Socrates rejects the suggestion on the grounds that even this science of advantage does not seem to have any intelligible links to temperance as the science of sciences. At this point, the discussion is declared dead. Even accepting a number of things as givens that didn't seem very likely at the time, the two men have still been unable even to come up with a definition or a use value for temperance. Charmides is not dissuaded by the failed discussion, however, and it is decided that he will see Socrates frequently to learn from him and to pursue the true meaning of temperance.